Hi all. Last time I told you a story, I think I left off about the time that Grandpa had kicked his cousin Kenneth out of bed for wetting the bed. And that was at the point in his life where he was headed off to Henniger's Business College, which became LDS Business College. He tells a little story about his experience there learning shorthand that I thought was kind of interesting, especially at this time where some of you are being homeschooled and you might be ready to throw your hands in the air and give it all up. Grandpa says that when he went to Henniger's, he enrolled in a typing class, among other things, but that was his first class, was typing, and a shorthand class. And for those of you who remember Grandpa, he was really good at shorthand. He remembered it his whole entire life. But he said it was a tough course, really a tough course. He said, I couldn't make heads nor tails out of this shorthand stuff. He said it may as well have been written in Greek. He said, I couldn't believe that anything could be so absolutely incomprehensible. He left the class one day, and he said for some reason he'd gone down to the study hall and was sitting in the study hall. He said usually at that hour of the day he was in the elevator, running the elevator, which is what he did for his job to pay for school. But he sat down with his Greg shorthand book and was looking through it going, this makes no sense. And he said it didn't matter where I opened it, none of it made sense. The beginning, the end, the middle, so whatever. He said, I thought, I have just wasted 6 weeks trying to figure this out. And I know nothing. He said the thought came to him that, well, you're really no more stupid than any of the other guys in this class, so let's have one more look at it. Let's just give it another shot. So he said, I opened the book and just flipped through it thinking, you don't understand any of it, so any place is as good as another to start. So I just flipped the book open, set it down, and looked at it. And I looked at that book, and literally, as if the shackles had been stricken from his eyes, he could read it. He said, I looked around and thought, well, that's kind of strange. All of a sudden, I can read this. And he said, I turned the page over and realized I can read that too. He said, gee whiz, something's wrong here. I could read it. And just like that, I thought, well, my heavens. So he said, I went back to the first of the book and started the front of the book and went through the pages one at a time, studied every lesson, and learned exactly what he was supposed to know. It all made sense. And he said, I studied that book right up to the place where we were working in class. And he said, I can't describe how simple it was when I started looking at it, realizing I can read it suddenly. He said, it was just as if it had come embedded in my brain. He said, so I went to class the next day and sat through the lecture. And after the class, the lady who was the teacher asked him to stay for a few minutes after class. So he wandered up front, and she said, I want to know what's happened to you. And he said, I'm not sure I can explain it, but suddenly I know how to read Greg shorthand. And she just kind of smiled and said, well, isn't that marvelous? Sometimes it just happens that way. She said, aren't you glad you hung in there for 2 or 3 days more instead of just quitting? And I think that's a pretty good piece of advice. Sometimes you just keep banging away at it, even if it feels like it's never going to give way, and open up your mind, and there it is. So hang in there. Don't give up. That reminds me of one of his stories in his book about the little gray cat. Anyway, after he finished his coursework at Henniger's, he got a job as an order clerk at an office supply store. And he said the guy that ran the store was just crazy. He knew all the forms. They all had special numbers. And he said it took him a long time to figure it out, but he finally understood what was a stock number and what was an order number. And felt like he was pretty good at that. But after 6 months of working for them, right before Christmas, the owner of the company called him into the office and said, "We've been watching you for the last 6 months, and it's going to be tough on us, but we think we can probably try and run this business without you in the future." I said, "Really, you're going to fire me?" And they said, "Yeah, that's what we're going to do." Okay, well, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. So right before Christmas, he found himself unemployed. And for most of the month of January, he was the poorest, he said, he ever remembers being in his entire life. He was sharing a little room with his grandmother in the Constitution Building on Main Street in Salt Lake City. She lived there and was busy at the temple every day. It was handy and it was convenient to stay with her. But he said he got to the point where he had a nickel and a penny. And that was his complete resources, all the money that he had, except the money in the bank from his mother's death that he would never touch. Still thought he would never touch. One day a friend came to visit and said, "Hey, did you know that they're looking for a stenographer downtown for this law firm? You ought to go apply." So on the spot, he jumped up, changed his shirt, and ran down to the Kearns building to the office of Ryder, Ritter, and Collin. And he interviewed with them. In came Mr. Ritter, who he said was a big, burly guy. He's smoking a big cigar. This is a law firm. And he said, "Are you a stenographer?" And Dad said, "Yeah, I am." "Yes, sir." "Are you a good one?" "Yes, sir." "All right, when can you go to work?" And he said, "Right now." All right, and called a secretary in who got Dad a stenographer's notebook and a pen and said, "Let's just see how you can do." Handed him a fountain pen and pulled the cap off and started. And he said, Mr. Ritter let go at about 100 miles an hour of the craziest legal jargon he'd ever heard, just as fast as he could spit it out, and big words, long sentences, just crazy. And he said after he got done doing that for a while, he stopped, looked at Dad and said, "Did you get all that?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "All right, let's send you into the back. Go back and see Bob. He'll set you up with a typewriter. Type it up." So he walked into the back, and there sat Bob, who said, "Sit here, you can use this typewriter." And then turned to John and said, "Did you get all that?" And he said, "No." And Bob said, "What are you going to do about that?" He said, "Well, I figure if you're sitting back here listening to what's going on out there, hopefully you're the kind of guy who's taken some notes and can back me up. And if you're not, this isn't the kind of place I want to work anyway." Bob just chuckled and he said, "Yeah, I was taking notes. Here you go." Handed in the notes from what Mr. Ritter had been spouting, and the two of them got it all typed up and in the proper format and sent it back off to the boss, who came back and said, "Well, that's not bad," and hired him, said come back to work in the morning. So he worked with them for quite a while. Mr. Ritter turned out to be a real character. One of his pleasures was spouting these big words, which, of course, John loved. Big words. That was just right down his alley. And he said the trick was learning when he was dictating to get just the dictation for the letter down and not all of his side comments to the other employees, or if he was shooting pool at the time, because Dad would go up to his house in the evenings, because Mr. Ritter was married and he and his wife had no children, and so he'd work in the evenings, and John would go downstairs to his big family room and watch him play pool and take dictation on these business letters at the same time. So it was a little tricky to leave out the 8-ball in the side pocket during the dictation, but he learned how to do that. It was while he was working for them and was quite happy, excited to have a good job and making a living and supporting himself, that he applied for a civil service job. He'd seen some advertisements for that and thought, can't hurt to apply. So he filled out the application. You had to be able to take dictation at 96 words a minute and type about that fast. And he said, that was child's play for me. I could do that pretty easily. So sure enough, he passed the test with flying colors. And in April, he got a phone call from the Yellowstone Park Company asking him to come to Yellowstone and take a job there. And so it took him a while to make that decision, because he had a good job, and Yellowstone was a wild and crazy and quiet place back in those days. But he decided that that was what he was going to do. And so he left Salt Lake, moved to Yellowstone Park, was there for 5.5 years, and left with a wife and his first daughter. And I'll tell you more about that next time.